In the heart of a forgotten town, there stood a place with twisted trees that reached out like gnarled fingers and crumbling buildings that whispered tales of a time long past. This town, dubbed Hollow Grove, was hidden away from the world, surrounded by a thick mist that rolled in every evening, creating a chilling atmosphere that cloaked everything. The streets were usually abandoned, silent except for the lonely sound of wind rustling through dry leaves and occasionally, the soft echo of footsteps from a few straggling souls who wandered aimlessly under the flickering streetlights. Those lights often buzzed and crackled, casting spooky shadows that danced around every corner. It was a town frozen in time, as if it had been pulled away from reality itself, where shadows clung tightly to the edges, whispering secrets that sent shivers down the spines of the few brave souls who dared to remain. Among these few souls lived a boy named Simon. Simon was like any other 10-year-old boy, filled with dreams and an imaginative spirit. He loved to play outside when the sun was high in the sky, feeling the warmth wrap around him like a cozy blanket. On sunny days, he would often race with the wind, his laughter mingling with the chirps of birds and the rustling of leaves. But lately, that warmth felt distant and hard to grasp. The sunlight had begun to feel more like a flickering candle struggling to stay lit, barely grazing his skin, leaving him chilled even in the brightest of afternoons. One peculiar evening, as Simon made his way home from school, he noticed something strange about the people around him. They moved slowly, but there was an unsettling air about them. Their faces seemed distorted, twisting in odd ways, as if gravity had turned them upside down. At first, he brushed it off as simple tiredness or perhaps the effect of the heavy shadows that loomed as the sun began to set. His tired mind lingered on the horror stories he had read, stories that danced in his thoughts like playful ghosts. But as more people passed him in the twilight glow, the chill in the air thickened. Their eyes were piercing, like shards of ice cutting straight through the darkness, and their mouths opened wide, but no sound escaped, giving the illusion of laughter that felt mocking and cruel. Feeling a mix of confusion and fear, Simon quickened his pace, a sense of dread wrapping around him like a cloak. It was as if the air itself was heavy with a sense of foreboding. Each person he encountered seemed all too aware of his growing anxiety. Their grotesque visages starkly contrasted against the last rays of daylight, their laughter fading into a hissing whisper that followed him. Simon could almost feel their eyes devouring him, scrutinizing his every move, their unusual forms making his heart race like a wild animal. As Simon hurried to his home, he felt an urgent need to escape those unnerving gazes. The comforting silhouette of his house loomed ahead, its familiar shape standing proud against the shadows, and at that moment, he longed for the safety that a solid door could provide. With a burst of energy, he pushed the door open and slammed it shut behind him, sealing the darkness outside. Inside his small, cluttered room, filled with toys, books, and drawings that marked the passing years, Simon fought to shake off the anxiety that clung to him. His collection of action figures stood vigil on the shelves, gazing down at him like silent guardians. But even the innocence of his surroundings could not dispel the lingering darkness from the streets outside. The comforting sounds of home felt quieter, more distant as night cloaked the town. It wrapped around him, making the world outside feel even more menacing. Simon decided to hide from the world, avoiding the windows that now seemed to invite the outside in. Shrouded in darkness, the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and every creak of the house felt like an affront, as if the very walls conspired against him, teasing out his fears. Later that evening, his mother called him to dinner. The delicious smell of his favorite meal wafted through the house, wrapping around him like a warm hug. He could smell the rich aroma of spaghetti and meatballs, his mouth watering at the thought of sinking his teeth into them. Yet, as he sat at the table and stared at the perfectly plated food, it felt bland and lifeless, merely a shadow of its true flavor. The comforting sights and smells of home were dulled by the uneasiness that gripped him like a vice. Simon glanced up at his mother, hoping to find solace in her familiar smile. But an uneasiness surged through him as he looked closely at her face. For a fleeting moment, he thought he noticed the contours of her features tilted, her smile transformed into what seemed like a gruesome imitation of happiness. Shaking his head, he dismissed the thought as pure imagination, a consequence of the eerie encounter in the streets. "It's just the dark playing tricks on me," he whispered under his breath, trying to reclaim his bravery. The day dragged on, and as Simon lay in bed that night, sleep eluded him like a shy child. He stared up at the ceiling, watching the shadows dance in the flickering light of the night lamp. The shadowy figures he had seen earlier danced within his thoughts, their inverted faces haunting him, filling him with an unsettling dread. Was it just him? Was his mind cracking under the weight of fear like an old building about to collapse? But as the hours stretched on into the deep of night, an unholy sensation coursed through him. He felt watched, as if unseen eyes were lurking in the darkness, observing his every move. With every soft creak of the house, Simon felt his heart race faster. He clutched his blanket, wishing more than anything for morning to come and wash away the darkness. As he closed his eyes, a wave of longing washed over him. He desperately wished the nightmares would disappear like autumn leaves caught in a wild wind, flung away from him forever. Finally, fatigue took hold and sleep claimed him, pulling him into a world where dreams and nightmares intertwined. When Simon found himself in this dream, he stood once more on the familiar streets of his town, yet everything appeared muted and soaked in a colorless haze. People moved about him, their twisted faces echoing his earlier fears, and their features felt wrong, grotesque and alien. They walked in an eerie, synchronized manner, each step in rhythm with a haunting melody that played over and over again in his mind. The buildings around him seemed taller, looming like silent giants, their windows filled with matching faces that glared down at him. Each person he passed wore an expression that made Simon's skin crawl. Suddenly, an alarming realization struck Simon. He was the only one with the right face, the only one who looked normal. The weight of their collective gaze became unbearable, pinching at his heart with icy fingers, squeezing the breath from his lungs. "Help!" Simon shouted, but no sound came out. He opened his mouth wide, but the people moved on, their distorted features ignoring him. They merely continued their eerie dance, their movements gliding seamlessly into one another as if they were puppets controlled by an unseen force. Gasping for air, the dream threw Simon back into consciousness. He woke from his nightmare, panic surging through him like a jolt of electricity. Clambering out of bed, he dashed to the bathroom, desperate for the cool, harsh light that brought clarity. He flipped the switch, and cold fluorescent light flooded the small room, illuminating the mirror. Staring into the glass, he paused, heart racing, terror gripping his insides like a vice. At first, his reflection appeared normal. "Just breathe," he whispered to himself, convincing himself that it was nothing. But beneath the harsh light, his heart sank. Suddenly, a chill enveloped him, and his face twisted and contorted in the mirror, the panic of realization washing over him like a tidal wave of nausea. The boy he had seen moments earlier was starting to transform, the usual features he was familiar with becoming something grotesquely sinister, an unholy caricature of himself. He stumbled backward, collapsing to the floor, the world spinning around him. The walls felt like they were closing in, a reminder of the nightmare he thought he could outrun. In a panic, he pressed his hands to his cheeks, hoping to feel the familiar warmth of his own skin, but his hands found only a cold, clammy surface. The more he pressed against his face, the more he feared it would slip away entirely. "What is happening to me?" Simon cried out into the empty air of his bathroom, desperation lacing his voice. Tears filled his eyes as he scrambled back to the mirror, frantically searching for the familiar boy he used to be. He felt trapped, spiraling into a dark pit of despair that he could not climb out of. The nightmare he thought lay far behind was now a reality, and he was determined to find a way back. As he sat on the floor, knees pulled tightly to his chest, the shadows began to stretch and fade around him, their shapes morphing in the dim light. With every heartbeat, he felt a stubborn flicker of hope, a small spark fighting against the encroaching dark. Maybe he could find a way to change things back, to confront whatever darkness had taken hold of his town. But how? The question lingered in his mind, forming into a whisper that echoed against the walls. The night wore on, and Simon sat in the silence of the early morning, listening to the town outside. Every soft sound seemed amplified in the stillness, the gentle rustling of leaves, the quiet chatter of distant creatures preparing for the dawn. He began to calm himself, breathing in time with the rhythm of the world waking up around him. Suddenly, a glimmer of determination ignited within him. If he could figure out the riddle of the town, he might just reclaim what was lost. The time for hiding was over. He must gather his courage and uncover the secrets that lay hidden in the shadows of Hollow Grove. With that thought, he stood up, renewed strength surging through him. He smoothed his trembling hands over his pajama pants, glancing back into the mirror. The reflection still bore traces of the surreal horror he had seen but now carried a sense of purpose. Simon vowed to confront this terrifying mystery, to find out what had turned the people of his town into the eerie, nightmarish figures he could not escape. Taking a deep breath, he opened the bathroom door, stepping back into the darkened hallway. The adventure to reclaim his town and possibly even himself was just beginning. He knew he would need to gather his courage, face his fears, and unlock the mysteries buried deep within Hollow Grove, for the truth awaited, hiding just beyond the flickering lights. And Simon was ready to uncover it. Days slipped by with a melancholy pace, each one merging into the next, a feeling of sadness mixing with a heavy blanket of dread. The town's air hung thick with a stench of decay, a smell that reminded Simon of something rotten hidden deep in the earth. There were days when he might have caught a whiff of pine or freshly baked bread, but now those scents felt like distant memories. Simon's isolation grew day by day as he avoided mingling with anyone. What had once been vibrant laughter and shouts of playtime transformed into a mournful silence that rang through the streets, making the world feel empty. Simon felt like a ghost, a shadow lurking inside his own home. How had things gotten this way? The world outside felt like a forsaken land, barren of joy and light. The cheerful chatter he had once enjoyed so much drifted far away, and instead, the streets echoed with nothing, an eerie silence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Simon, once filled with energy and curiosity, now became a prisoner within his own home. Every day seemed the same, and in the weeks that followed, he would catch glimpses of his own inverted face staring back at him in every reflective surface he could find. The window panes, the glossy surfaces of appliances, even the shimmering puddles left behind after the rain. With every glance, a sickening feeling settled deeper into his gut, a reminder of the nightmare that surrounded him. It felt like a heavy rock sitting deep within, refusing to let him forget what he had become. Desperate to escape this nightmare clinging to him, he reluctantly ventured outside once more. The town lay before him, dark and ominous, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground, creeping closer as if they wanted to swallow him whole. Each footstep felt louder than the last, echoing ominously against the cobblestones beneath him. With each step he took, Simon's heart raced like a drumbeat. He wondered if he would find just a glimmer of his old life or if it, too, had been swept away by the witch's curse. As he moved deeper into town, he noticed a gathering in the town square, an eerie congregation forming just ahead of him. People stood whispering amongst themselves, their faces twisted and inverted, their expressions wild and unrecognizable. They turned to him, and in that moment, Simon felt his heart drop like a stone. Their eyes were wide, alien-looking, and seemed to bore into him with a chill that froze him in place. Laughter erupted from the crowd, a sound like jagged glass that pierced the air, sending chills thundering down Simon's spine. Instead of feeling comforted, he felt only terror overshadowing what was left of his spirit. For a brief moment, he wished they would understand his plight, that they might extend a hand to help him escape this torment. Instead, they embraced him with a malevolence that twisted the very air around him. Their features curled into smiles that reflected a dark mirth, as if his suffering was their ultimate delight. "What have you become?" one of the figures rasped, the voice sounding like hushed whispers through dry leaves. The words settled heavy in the air, like a death knell. Simon's heart raced as panic took hold. He stumbled back, overwhelmed by a wave of betrayal that crashed over him like an unforgiving tide. His own reflection joined the crowd, mocking him, an inverted face of an unholy sibling ready to drag him into the depths of despair. In that moment, feeling their cold stares wrap around him, he turned and fled, desperation fueling his escape as the horrible laughter pursued him, echoing long after he had vanished into the streets. Days morphed into a frantic blur as Simon struggled to navigate through the horrors of this new reality. Even at school, where children once chased each other in playful innocence, his classmates appeared as warped versions of themselves. Their faces were upside down, their blood-curdling grins etched across their features, making him feel utterly alone. He was a ghost in a realm twisted by phantoms of despair. The lively laughter that had once filled the corridors now only reminded him of the life he could no longer grasp. Seeking refuge from the distorted reality outside, he found solace in the library, a sanctuary filled with the whispers of forgotten tales. The comforting scent of old paper and the rustle of pages created a cozy cocoon around him, offering a respite from the horrors beyond the door. Yet, even within these walls, shadows lurked. They swirled in the corners of his mind, entwining like dark tendrils, threatening to pull him back into despair. As he flipped through book after book, desperate for some nugget of understanding, he stumbled upon a title that caught his eye: The Curse of the Inverted. His heart raced. Could this book hold the key to breaking the wicked spell binding him to this grotesque existence? Days spent reading through the dusty tome revealed a sinister tale. According to the book, a witch had cursed the town, twisting the faces of its inhabitants to reflect their inner devils, their vile desires manifesting on their faces. The realization hit Simon like a cold splash of water. The only path to reverse the curse was by confronting one's own darkness. But the more Simon read, the more hopeless he felt. With each page, he battled inwardly with the notion. What darkness could he confront when he was already soaked in shadows, devoured by fear? He was merely a child, overshadowed by the grotesque figures around him, trapped within a labyrinth from which escape seemed utterly unattainable. In the back of his mind, a twisted thought invaded his consciousness. Perhaps the way to free himself lay in facing that reality head-on. Gritting his teeth, Simon resolved to find the witch who had instigated this suffering upon his town. Clenching the book tightly, its pages felt cold against his skin, as if recounting the sorrow inscribed within the terrifying words. Gathering the remnants of his courage, he set out toward the haunted woods that edged the town, driven by an unyielding determination. The ground beneath him crunched softly with fallen leaves as he marched, each step echoing the resolve he had built deep inside. The sun, although hidden behind heavy clouds, cast a muted glow over the path leading into the thick underbrush. Shadows danced menacingly, and he felt as if he were not alone in this wilderness, a malignant presence lurking just beyond the periphery, watching, waiting for him to falter. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the dazzling colors of nature muted, as if the curse had seeped even here, draining life and light. The shimmering light from the moon splayed across the twisted branches, illuminating Simon's path like a beacon of hope against the eerie darkness. He swallowed hard, aware that what lay ahead was not merely the witch's lair but a confrontation with the fears that had nestled themselves within his heart. At the core of the forest, he discovered a dilapidated shack that appeared to have grown from the very earth itself. Its structure was cloaked in thick vines and despair, looking as if it had been forgotten by time. The door creaked ominously as he nudged it open, revealing a dim interior brimming with strange, ominous artifacts that told tales of sorrows long past. The air inside was thick and stale, filled with an unsettling energy that prickled against his skin. At the center of the shack sat a woman shrouded in darkness, her hair tangled like thick, black shadows spilling down her frail shoulders. The flickering light from the nearby candle danced across her features, but still, her face remained hidden, a void hauntingly obscured. However, it was the weight of her gaze that struck Simon the hardest. It felt as if she could peer straight into his soul, unveiling his deepest fears and the tiniest fragments of joy that lingered like fading stars. "Why do you seek me, boy?" she croaked, her voice a whisper tinged with malice, like the wind rustling through dry leaves. "I want my face back," he shouted, his voice trembling but filled with the rage of a life turned upside down. Each word felt like a spark he had ignited within himself, a flicker of the fire that remained hidden but still burned. The witch laughed, a guttural sound that echoed around the walls of the shack like thunder, reverberating deep into his bones. "There is no returning, only acceptance. Face the truth. There lies within you a darkness far worse than that which I inflicted upon your hapless town." Her challenge sent waves of despair crashing over Simon, each word hitting him like stones thrown into a still pond. Was this indeed an invitation to liberation or further torment? Thoughts raced as he grappled with the realization that he had, in fact, begun to become one with the shadows of agony that surrounded him. A part of him had already surrendered to the horror, while the other clung fiercely to the hope that he could find a way to escape this fate. The struggle within him felt endless, but as he looked deep into her eyes, Simon knew he had no choice but to confront his fears and accept the darkness within him, no matter how painful it might be. Only then might he find a way to reclaim his face, and maybe even the town he once cherished. With the witch's laughter ringing in his ears, Simon turned and fled from the shack. The night sky above him was thick with dark clouds, hiding the stars and the soft grace of the moon. The trees around him, tall and twisted, loomed like shadows come to life, their branches swaying and reaching, as if they had hands. Their gnarled fingers seemed to grasp at him, as though trying to pull him back into the very place he feared most. Simon's heart raced like a drum in his chest, pounding with each hurried step he took. He sprinted through the labyrinth of twisted trunks and whispering leaves, fear driving him onward. The ground felt uneven beneath his feet, twigs snapping like bones as he pushed deeper into the woods. Every breath he took felt like fire in his lungs. With every step, he felt the chill from the sorrowful trees wrapping around him, trying to hold him tight in a cold embrace. The horrifying laughter of the witch faded slowly into silence behind him, but the fear grew like a dark vine in his heart, whispering that the horrors he had faced were not fully behind him. Darkness never truly leaves. It lingers like a shadow waiting for the moment to pounce. As he burst out of the edge of the woods, Simon stumbled onto the familiar, worn path that led back to town. Moonlight tried to break through the thick clouds, casting eerie, flickering shadows that danced around him. But he was too shaken to notice their beauty. The streets of his little town were quiet, too quiet, as though everyone were holding their breath. It felt odd, like walking into a painting where the colors felt wrong. Returning home, Simon noticed a heavy, dark despair enveloping him, heavier than the weight of the clouds above. Each of the mirrors in his house reflected back a grotesque version of himself, a nightmare made real. His face, once filled with youth and wonder, now seemed unnaturally twisted, an unholy mask he could not strip away. In his reflection, he saw the eerie glints of his own haunted eyes staring back, the corners of his mouth curling in ways he didn't understand, like a broken puppet struggling to find its strings. The townspeople stood as phantoms on the edges of his reality, shadowy figures blending into the twilight. Their features were warped and eerie, their faces shifting into unsettling grins and grotesque shapes. They loitered like echoes of a forgotten song, a chorus of twisted melodies murmuring in his ears. They watched him through the cracked glass of their forsaken homes, their unholy eyes following him, tracing his every movement. The chilling fear of their gaze felt like ice on his skin, leaving him shivering as he hurried past them. Back in the safety of his home, things grew even darker. His family life felt like a dreamed memory, slipping between the fingers as easily as sand. His mother, once a comforting presence, now wore a smile so unnerving that it shimmered under the strain of their shared torment. She would sit in the kitchen hours longer than normal, her hands clasped tightly as she stared into space, her eyes distant and unseeing. The bright light of the room felt muted, a dim echo of its former warmth. Simon tried time and again to reach out to her, to find solace in the arms that had once hugged him tightly, the arms that were once a safe harbor. But all he felt when he did was the palpable whispers of judgment hidden in the depths of her gaze, shadows of sorrow that only reminded him of his own nightmares. He could sense her fear, a reflection of his own, and it made him feel more alone. At the periphery of his sanity, he realized that isolation had seeped deep, like roots penetrating through the surface. It wrapped around him tightly, squeezing his heart, tightening its grasp with each passing second. Every glance, every secretive smile from the cursed figures around him confirmed that he was no longer a boy marked by the innocence of youth, but a malignant shadow lost in a town of broken souls. He had become one with their sinister existence, the festering darkness entwining within him, twisting him into an unspeakable horror that clawed at his very being. In an explosion of despair, Simon became fueled by a sudden spark of determination. He decided to tear apart the pages of the old book in search of something he might have missed, a glimmer of hope, a hidden secret. As he yanked the pages, fragments fluttered through the air, lingering like specters of sorrow. Words and images whirled around him, faces blurred into memories, distorted and sorrowful. The pages smelled of dust and forgotten stories, and with each piece that floated away, he felt the weight of reality shifting. He could hardly keep track of which page was which as he cast them aside, feeling them spin in the winds of fate. These written words cried out for attention, reaching for him even as he tossed them away carelessly. They found solace in the crooked branches of fate that beckoned him closer and closer to something he did not yet understand. As the night cloaked the world around him, Simon felt a surge of resolve. He needed to confront the dark shadows that had haunted him. He stumbled through the town once more, each step heavy with the past and trembling uncertainty. The townspeople, who had once felt familiar, now were twisted figures in his mind. He was determined to face them, to seek out the truth hidden within their haunting faces. He arrived at the town square, where the haunting congregation had once encircled him, engulfing him in their nightmarish laughter. The square was oddly silent now, almost as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for the next act in this play of horrors. The figures stood there again, their faces distorted and wild, like grotesque marionettes strung by an unseen puppeteer, twisted by the weight of their own despair. With trembling legs, he took a step forward. "I will not cower among you," he declared, though his voice was weak, betraying him like a frightened child. The darkness that enveloped him felt alive, the air shifting with eerie energy. The crowd responded with laughter, the sound echoing through the square, a chilling, blood-curdling cacophony that pierced the night like sharpened glass. "You think you can escape?" One figure, dressed in tattered clothing that swayed like a flag of defeat, mocked him, stepping forward, eyes glinting with malicious glee. "You are already ours, boy. Your face is as twisted as the rest of us." A shiver ran down Simon's spine. He felt something snap within him, a final shred of the old Simon breaking free. With desperate passion, he summoned his courage and shouted, "I am not one of you. You will not claim me." His defiance ignited a spark within his heart, a flicker of light battling against the suffocating darkness. But the wicked laughter only grew louder, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. The crowd swirled, a cyclone of grotesque faces pushing against him, their smiles twisting wider, consuming him in their ghastly mockery. Fear coiled tighter, leaving him breathless and gasping, choking under the weight of the reality he faced. As the twisted forms crawled closer, he stumbled back, caught between the grotesque crowd and the darkness looming behind him. The air was thicker now, suffocating his pleas for help, drowning him in a sea of despair. He sought for something, anything, to pull him from the grasp of the night, desperate to find the remnants of the boy he once was, to reveal the light buried beneath those hollow eyes that surrounded him. Suddenly, it struck him. The world around him was not a separate place, it was a reflection of the turmoil within him. Each twisted smile, each ghastly face mirrored his fears, his pain. The realization crashed over him with the weight of 1,000 storms, and he felt his will crumble beneath the shadows of despair. In one last bid to escape the encroaching darkness, he turned and ran back toward the woods that had once offered him comfort. The shadows rushed to envelop him, their whispers turning into a deafening roar, clamoring for acceptance, beckoning him to surrender his light. But as his heartbeat ricocheted wildly within his chest like a runaway train, he felt the inescapable truth clawing at him from the recesses of despair. In his attempt to confront the darkness, he had been swallowed whole, becoming one with the void that had claimed so many before him. Now utterly consumed, his troubled heart echoed in the silence as he accepted the irrevocable steep into eternal night. But in that very darkness, he felt a flicker, the tiniest spark of hope, faint but unmistakable. Hidden deep within him was a glimmer of resilience, a whisper that dared to defy the night. He could feel it, pulsing in his chest, reminding him that he was still there, still fighting. It was a flicker that could one day reignite the light, if only he would give it a chance. He had not given up yet, not by a long shot. Yet, what would the morning bring? Only time would tell if he could rise from this shadow or if he would remain lost in the grasp of the darkness forever. Weeks passed in a swirling fog, each day blending into the next. Simon felt like he was caught in a haunting rhythm of despair, almost like he was dancing to a sad song that would never end. At first, he had thought he could escape the dark shadows that hung over him, but they only seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Friends who once laughed and played in the sun had turned into mere shadows of their former selves. When he looked at them, their faces twisted in ways that made it hard for him to recognize them. It was as if someone had taken the bright colors of his world and turned them into ghostly shades of gray. Every time he met someone in the streets or at school, it felt like he was dancing with death. They whispered strange and creepy things to him, riddles filled with darkness. What could they want? Were they trying to peek inside his mind? Were they hoping to see the last bits of his sanity crumble in their presence? This feeling weighed on him like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. The laughter that followed him through the halls of his mind was not the joyful sound he cherished, it was a cold, haunting echo. It wrapped around him like thick fog, making him feel lost and confused. The townspeople, these faces he had once loved and trusted, now looked grotesque and frightening. Their smiles, which had once brought him joy, became twisted and empty, sending chills down his spine. It was hard for him to understand how such a transformation had happened in such a short time. In the quiet moments of the day, when he was alone in his dim room, Simon would sit on his bed, staring at the cracks in the walls. Each crack held memories of days he could barely recall. He thought about the times when laughter filled the air, and everything seemed bright and cheerful. Those were the days that now felt like distant dreams, far removed from the darkness that had unfolded before him. It was as if some dark curtain had been drawn over his life, obscuring everything good and pure. He often found himself drawn to the mirror, an unexplainable urge pushing him closer, almost like it was calling his name. As he stood there, the rhythm of his heart raced, pounding against his chest like a drum. He wanted to know the truth, to see if there was still a flicker of his former self hidden behind those murky eyes. The tension built inside him like a balloon ready to pop. When he gazed into the mirror, the reality of his situation struck him like a thunderbolt. The reflection staring back at him was not the boy who had laughed and played mere weeks ago. Instead, he saw a form twisted and hollow, consumed by the very darkness he had spent so much time trying to escape. It was terrifying, feeling like he had stepped into a nightmare where everything he once knew was unrecognizable. The stillness around him felt heavy, broken only by the sound of his own spiraling breath. The familiar reflection had been replaced by that grotesque figure, a testament to the curse that wrapped around his heart, squeezing tighter with every glance. A chill raced down his spine as fear gripped him. It was as if the dark presence within him had taken on a physical form, making it impossible for him to run away. Desperate for comfort, he dashed through the gloomy hallways of his home, the world whirling around him. He was drawn to his mother, the one person who, above all, could comfort him. But as he reached her, he quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Her eyes, which had often sparkled with warmth and love, now held an inner darkness he could hardly understand. They seemed to swallow the light, leaving only a hollow void. "Simon," she spoke softly, but her voice was wrapped in a coldness that sent shivers coursing through him. "You will join us. You already have." Her words hung in the air, twisting like tendrils of smoke, intertwining themselves with his very being. The sinister grin that spread across her inverted face mirrored the depth of his despair. With those chilling words, everything inside him shattered. The pieces of his innocence slipped through his fingers, falling away into the deep chasm of despair that yawned wide within his heart. Every struggle he had made to resist the darkness felt pointless. He realized then, with a growing sense of dread, that this twisted reality was all he had left. The truth echoed through him, sharp and clear. There was truly no escape. The darkness embraced him like an old friend, wrapping its arms around him tightly. Each scream that threatened to break free fell silent as if swallowed by the very shadows that haunted him. His cries for help vanished into the twisted fates of the townspeople, those who had once held love and warmth in their hearts but now reveled in the nightmarish laughter that filled the air like a sinister song. Simon became just a shadow among them, blending into their wickedness. He was lost, swallowed whole by the giggles and whispers that twisted around him like a noose. The air felt heavy with dreams that had turned sour, suffocating every last flicker of his resolve to fight back. What was once a spark of hope faded into nothingness. And then, something strange began to shift within him. In the chilling embrace of acceptance, he felt a strange wave of relief wash over him. No longer did he resist the inevitable. Instead, he chose to surrender to the darkness that lured him in. With a heart twisted like the faces that surrounded him, he allowed the cold grasp of despair to claim him, accepting a fate that rang true through every fiber of his being. As he joined the congregation of the cursed, laughter bubbled up from his throat, spilling forth like a river rushing over the cliffs, a sound that mixed with the cacophony of twisted joy surrounding him. Together, they lost themselves in a wild dance, twirling and spinning, lost in the labyrinth of melancholy that shielded them from the outside world. They were entangled in a monstrous ballet, embracing the very essence of despair as they faded deeper into the night, one dark shadow among many. Within that forsaken town, the curse thrived and festered like a wound that refused to heal. Simon's laughter, once pure and cheerful, became mixed with unsettling echoes, merging seamlessly into the dissonant laughter of those around him. They roamed the insipid streets, an unholy choir singing the twisted song of their shared fate. The familiar comforts of his earlier life melted away, replaced by a blanket of constant darkness that swallowed any hint of light. As the clock struck midnight, Simon's face, now an eerie inversion of its former self, blended into the shadows that surrounded him. He was no longer the boy who ran in the sun or laughed freely with his friends. He had become a permanent part of this nightmare. An eternal reflection of the horrors that had shattered his spirit, he faded further into the night. Together, they created a haunting symphony of grotesque laughter, a song echoing through the winding streets of the cursed town where innocence had once thrived, now lost forever in the darkness that had become his new reality.